Summer can be a bit of a slog. For us, it's often for some reason a rather busy time, and I'm sure we're not alone.
Well, you can beat the summertime sadness and the August angst and enhance your everyday with our excellent sponsor, Via Hemp. This is a company that crafts award-winning premium THC and THC-free gummies.
Each of these gummies is especially designed to cultivate a specific mood. Whether you're looking to get relaxed, get quality sleep, get creative, or just to get focused. If you're 21 or older, you can experience it for yourself and get 15% off your first order with our exclusive code MSheet at viahemp.com. That's VIIAHEMP.com.
I personally enjoyed their grapefruit flow state gummies. This CBG and CBD powerhouse really helped me tap into my productivity. Like, we have had an extremely busy summer, and I feel flow state got me over the finish line a few times when I was editing multiple episodes a day, digging through documents, and knocking out a bunch of interviews.
Via Hemp does not require a medical card, and it ships legally to all 50 states. It's also affordable, and even more so for Murder Sheet listeners who get a special deal.
If you're 21 and older, head to viahemp.com and use code MSheet to receive 15% off. That's VIIAHEMP.com and use code MSheet at checkout. After you purchase, they ask you where you heard about them. Please support our show and tell them we sent you. Enhance your everyday with Via.
This season, Instacart has your back to school. As in, they've got your back to school lunch favorites, like snack packs and fresh fruit. And they've got your back to school supplies, like backpacks, binders, and pencils. And they've got your back when your kid casually tells you they have a huge school project due tomorrow. Let's face it, we were all that kid. So first call your parents to say I'm sorry, and then download the Instacart app to get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes all school year long. Get a $0 delivery fee for your first 3 orders while supplies last. Minimum $10 per order. Additional terms apply.
Have you ever covered a carpet stain with a rug? Ignored a leaky faucet? Pretended your half-painted living room is supposed to look like that? Well, you're not alone. We've all got unfinished home projects. But there's an easier way. Thumbtack is the app that makes it easier to care for your home. Pull out your phone and in just a few taps, search, chat, and book highly rated pros right in your neighborhood. Download Thumbtack and start caring for your home the easier way.
Content warning. This episode contains discussion of drug abuse and death.
Our new recurring series, The Fentanyl Files, seeks to get at the heart of a crisis that is claiming lives across the United States of America. Fentanyl is a highly potent synthetic opioid. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, fentanyl has played the biggest role in the wider opioid epidemic since about 2016. It's cheap and accessible for dealers who get it through a pipeline that originates with precursors in China that get sent to Mexican drug cartels, who then manufacture the drug and traffic it into the United States.
Fentanyl is dangerous because it takes very little of the substance to kill a person. It can be mixed into other drugs like heroin or cocaine, or pressed into pills. According to the CDC, 150 people die daily from synthetic opioid overdoses, including those linked to fentanyl. Sometimes those struggling with drug addiction succumb to fentanyl overdoses. Others simply ingest a pill or a drug that they're not aware contains fentanyl. Young people experimenting with drugs are especially susceptible to this.
Legislators around the country are seeking to combat the epidemic of fentanyl deaths. Indiana's law on dealing in a controlled substance resulting in death went into effect in 2018. That holds that when the controlled substance is used, injected, inhaled, absorbed, or ingested, results in the death of a human being who used the controlled substance, commits dealing in a controlled substance resulting in death, a level 1 felony.
We feel that fentanyl deaths are somewhat undercovered in the true crime space, and we hope this recurring series sparks more conversations on this issue. Chief Deputy Prosecutor of Delaware County Zach Craig has convicted a number of dealers in fentanyl death cases as he fights for victims and their families. Melanie Pochek lost her young nephew Zachary to a fentanyl overdose and has spoken out on her family's experience ever since.
Today, we'll be talking to someone who can give us a completely different legal perspective. We'll be speaking with Timothy Sledd, the Chief Public Defender of Lawrence County in Indiana. He has another view of how law enforcement can better deal with the fentanyl crisis and prevent more unnecessary deaths. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murder Sheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases. We're The Murder Sheet.
And this is The Fentanyl Files, Dealing Resulting in Death, a conversation with Chief Defender Tim Sledd. To start off with, Tim, I know our listeners are probably pretty familiar with you at this point, but could you just start by telling us again a bit about yourself and your professional background?
Let's see. In the year 2001, I moved back to Indiana after my first year of law school. So summer of 2001, right before 9/11, I was starting law school here in Indiana again. I had a passion for criminal justice. My undergrad degree is in criminal justice, and I began working for the Indiana Federal Community Defenders, doing federal criminal defense work as an intern while I was in my second and third year of law school, right after 9/11 happened, right after, there was the anthrax scares and all of the bomb hoax scare stuff that was going on then, along with guns and child porn and all of the other things that the federal government deals with. I was helping the defense lawyers there. After law school, I went to grad school at Indiana University in the criminal justice department while I practiced privately doing criminal defense work, federal criminal defense work. I then moved to Bedford, Indiana, and became a contract public defender and hung my shingle, was in private practice. I was a judge for a year after one judge died and they needed to do an election cycle. And I was juvenile referee, juvenile law judge. And then I became the chief deputy prosecutor in Lawrence County for 6 years. Took a hiatus, moved to San Diego, opened a Brazilian jiu-jitsu gym, moved back to Indiana, was in private practice. And in 2022, I became the chief public defender in Lawrence County. So back to Bedford, completely different, other side of the courtroom. And I manage the public defender agency here. I have my own caseload, 7 lawyers under me, 5 staff members. We handle the indigent defense in Lawrence County.
Absolutely. I guess to kick off the subject we're going to be talking about, can you explain to us, sort of your understanding of fentanyl and specifically the fentanyl crisis, why it's so dangerous and how it's affected your community in practice? You've kind of been on both sides of this, prosecution and defense. And so we'd be really curious to get your perspective on this sort of particular drug.
Yeah. So unfortunately, in my career, I've gone from witnessing the basic drug problem in a community being weed and alcohol to the opioid crisis that started with methadone and OxyContin and the pills that were coming from pharmacies, legitimate medicines that were being illy prescribed. And as a young prosecutor, having to go to a lot of overdoses because hydrocodone addicts were going to pain management clinics and being given methadone, and the toxicology of those two drugs are significantly different. And the conditioning a person has on hydrocodone to take a number of pills at a particular time, if you do that with the same methadone pill, you overdose. So that was a problem in our community. So I've witnessed that from the prosecutor's side. And then methamphetamine resurged. The resurgence of that was mostly around the one-pot method, people cooking their own meth in backpacks and garages. And then that became problematic or hard for them to do. So the trafficking of the better product from Mexico or Central America California started happening around the time that I left the prosecutor's office. And then when I came back to practicing law in the state of Indiana in 2016, 2017, we were hearing heroin. I was hearing heroin, clients that were polysubstance abuse disordered with heroin, methamphetamine. And it blew my mind because heroin was kind of like a movie star drug when I was growing up. I didn't hear about it here. And as coming up as a prosecutor, that wasn't happening here, but was pretty common. Fentanyl took the stage, the front edge of the stage within the last 3 years as being something we're seeing a lot of, people addicted to, reading a lot about deaths from overdoses, then pill presses, which are kind of a part and parcel with trafficking. Fentanyl started to be targeted, and we would hear about people possessing large quantities of pills that were pressed here or believed to be pressed here. I would talk to prosecutors who are like, we're looking for the pill press. We want the pill press. We're one step behind the press. So I've watched this progression. I feel like an old man talking about, going from the good old days of weed and Mad Dog 2020 to, now we have all pharmaceutical, all not even real pharmaceutical, pseudo pharmaceutical grade dope that even kids are getting addicted to at a very young age, getting access to, dying from, experiencing grave addiction. So that's my experience with it professionally.
Achieving a gorgeous grin from home isn't a total mystery with Bite Clear aligners. Just don't be surprised if all of your sleuthing friends start asking, what's your secret? Begin by ordering your at-home impression kit today for only $14.95. Bite Clear aligners are doctor-directed and delivered to your door. Treatment costs thousands less than braces. Plus, they offer flexible financing, accept eligible insurance, and you can pay with your HSA FSA. Get 80% off your impression kit when you use code WONDERY at Byte.com. That's BYTE.com. Start your confidence journey today with Byte.
This episode is sponsored by AutoTrader. Credit scores, down payments, interest rates. Car buying can be a numbers game, but you don't have to be a math expert to get the keys to your dream car. Just use Kelley Blue Book My Wallet on AutoTrader. Crunch your numbers and get your personalized results so you know exactly how much you'll pay each month for your car. It's like having a magic wand for your wallet. Presto! The car you've been wanting is now within reach. So hit the road and leave your calculator at home. Find your next car on autotrader.com.
What makes a life a good one? Is it the adventure you have? Or the friends you find along the way? Maybe it's pursuing your passion while striving to protect, defend, and save what you believe in every single day. So what makes a life a good one? In the Coast Guard, we think it's all of the above and more. But you'll have to find out for yourself. Visit gocoastguard.com to learn more.
So, of course, back in 2018, Indiana passed a law dealing resulting in death. It calls for some pretty heavy penalties for people who supply drugs to someone who subsequently dies. And I'm just curious, how has this law affected things? What's your general opinion of this law?
I have to say that I 100% believe fentanyl is bad. It's evil. Doctors should be the only people that do anything with fentanyl. I also have a great deal of compassion and sympathy for surviving family members of folks who die from fentanyl overdoses, whether they wanted the fentanyl or whether they got slipped the fentanyl or whether they got slipped a cocktail of something that has fentanyl. I get it. This is not marijuana. It's not even alcohol. I mean, even though one really interesting thing to do is compare alcohol deaths to fentanyl deaths and look at how we craft laws around that. But later topic to discuss. The dealing resulting in death statute makes a lot of sense if you're operating from the perspective of a decedent's family or somebody who wants to run on a tough on crime stance, which is hugely popular in Indiana, specifically hugely popular in a red county, the law makes a lot of sense. The statute actually reads, and the case law breaks down, that in order to be guilty of it, you have to have delivered a controlled substance to a person, and the person has to have used that controlled substance, and that controlled substance has to have been the actual and proximate cause of your death. Now, to a lay person, that's all, word soup, but what that means to lawyers is that if you deal somebody a controlled substance and they take the controlled substance you use, it has to be the thing that kills them. And there has to be some foreseeability that it would kill them. So if I have a bottle of Advil and I have no reason to think any of the Advil pills are fentanyl, and I give you an Advil pill and it turns out to be somebody at Advil is trying to commit world murder and gives a fentanyl pill, and I kill somebody with that fentanyl pill, I am not guilty because it's not foreseeable that the Advil pill that I give you is the thing that killed you. Likewise, if I sell you heroin that has fentanyl in it and xylazine in it, and you're scared of the heroin, the fentanyl, and the xylazine I'm giving you, so between the time that I sell that to you, you go and you trade that xylazine, heroin, fentanyl mix for what you think to be a hydrocodone pill, which turns out to be a pressed fentanyl pill, and you die, I'm not guilty of that. Even though what I gave you is a part of the cause of your death, the law won't allow me to be convicted of giving you the heroin, fentanyl, and xylazine because you decided to go someplace and get a different drug from somebody else that killed you. So I understand how we get to the reaction of creating a level 1 felony. 20 to 40 years is the sentencing range offense for dealing drugs, killing somebody. That makes sense. If you're sitting in Indianapolis and you are a legislator and your neighbor had a kid overdose on dope and you're angry about it, it makes sense to write a severe sanction for this and come up with this law. But then you also have to look at how is it applied and what is its impact. And that's where, for me, the answer to Kevin's question is going to differ somewhat from other guests that you've had that have a more prosecutorial viewpoint on this. Nothing is going to bring the decedent back. My experience is, and I've listened to DEA task force members say this, is that most of the overdose deaths are not happening from a cartel dealer giving a person a drug and them overdosing. It's happening way down the chain. And it's happening addict to addict. And it's often, and one addict is cutting out of another addict's batch for him or herself as well. And they're overdosing. And so the culpability there, to me, is less than a murder. I listened to the podcast from the chief deputy prosecutor, and I understand his position. But one of the things he closed with is, I think we need to up the sanction to be more like murder. And I just say, hold on. Murder's different. Murder, you have an intention to kill. And we hold that to be the highest level. We hold attempted murder to be the next highest level. This crime right now is the same as attempted murder, where you have to show actual intent to kill somebody. And so it's a grave sanction. And the concern that I have is the ripple effect that this sanction has on the pragmatic approach to fighting the war on drugs. What do I mean by that? I have many law enforcement friends. In a trial that I just had, I had the uncomfortable job and task of taking a detective friend of mine who's a drug detective and putting his case through a ringer. It's hard to do. I respect him. I love what he does. I want him to pull bad drugs off the street. As a defense lawyer, I'm not out here jumping up and down saying, let's, abolish drug laws.
Let's do drugs.
I mean, I might say that, but but at the same time, I want this to be done right. And fentanyl is really bad, but squashing these addict, quote unquote, dealers, and they are dealers under Indiana law. If you hand somebody something, you don't have to get money back for it. You're a dealer. If I give you an Advil, I'm an Advil dealer. It's not against the law, but but that's how minimal it takes for you to be considered a dealer is delivery. But to squash the addict level dealer, which is where most of these the nexus between the death and the defendant is squashing essentially a foot soldier of the enemy with a $200,000 bomb. You completely annihilate another human being. And maybe that's just, I'm not going to say that's not just. If one of my kids dies and I find out that they got their dope from a dealer, I'm going to be very upset and I'm going to want heavy sanction and punishment. As a citizen who's paying tax dollars to fight a war on drugs, specifically fentanyl, it's not grown in Indiana. This thing has to come from some place that we know where it comes from. We know how it gets here. I've deposed DEA agents and I've talked to toxicologists and I've had trial after trial, and we know where this stuff is coming from. We know how it gets here. It's traffic. Why are we dropping $200,000 bombs on addict level, often homeless friends? I mean, even in one of your podcast or in the podcast that I listened to about one of the individuals that died, it was his buddy. And then some of the anecdotes that the chief deputy prosecutor was talking about, again, they're kind of like they're friends. We're not dealing with, we're not going up the food chain to really choke out fentanyl. We're spending a lot of resources on squashing low-level sharers or co-participants in this, and that doesn't lessen the value of the person's life who died. I don't want to do that. But what it does do is law enforcement gets incentive from closing cases, and they get incentive from closing big cases. So when you make squashing a low-level sharer an F1 felony, you de-incentivize moving up the chain. If you're looking at a dealing resulting in death case and you make the first handoff back up the chain toward the manufacturer, you make the next handoff significantly bigger than the handoff before that. Okay. The person who dealt to the addict may only be guilty of a level 6 felony. If, for example, they measure fentanyl in drug deals by 1/10 of a gram or half a 1/10 of a gram, under Indiana's law, that could be a level 6 felony, 6 months to 2.5 years. If a cop sees that, interrupts that, boom. But the exact same conduct of handing somebody that dope and then them dying is a level 1 felony, 20 to 40 years. Seems odd. And if you're a law enforcement officer, if you can close an F1 felony with, a review of a phone, an interview of a suspect, and you're done, that feels really good. Why go upstream? Because if you're going to go upstream, I'm going to go upstream and chase a level 6 felony. The other problem that we have that this highlights for me is a problem with decentralized and disorganized law enforcement between federal, state, and international entities. You want to fight fentanyl? You've got to engage in choking fentanyl off. Local police officers who are working in the town are going to be your data collectors. They're going to be bringing resources, information, intelligence from street level users. You're going to gather that just like you would gather information on a terrorist organization or child pornography ring, and you're going to track that back and to the source city, Indianapolis, Louisville, Evansville, Cincinnati, as up in Delaware County as the chief deputies at Dayton, Ohio.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a source city. Turn up the heat, squeeze, and then you get that next level dealer, and you squeeze, look at their phones, look at their internet traffic, wiretaps, poll cameras, all the things we know they use to track it to where are they getting it, California or Nashville, Tennessee, or Louisiana, where are they getting it, Texas? And then you create pinch points and you chase it just like you chase anything else to nip it in the bud. It's not marijuana. It's not growing in people's backyards. This is stuff that's being trafficked in. And we know it's being trafficked in. We know how it's being trafficked in. We know who has the incentive to traffic it in. The other, kind of gone off a little bit on a tangent here, but the other thing that I think is really justice for these victims and their families, and we will know if we're winning the war on fentanyl by asking the prosecutors, how are your seizures? How are the forfeiture funds coming? Because if you're fighting this international business, there's money. These people are not dealing fentanyl for the fun of it. I've had a DEA task force officer say that he's heard on a wire cartel people saying, we want our product to be good because we want people to buy it. And we're not even too concerned that some people may die in the process. So long as we know our stuff's good and they know our stuff's good, they're going to buy it from us. Buy, dollar sign, dollar sign, dollar sign. So we're dealing with a for-profit business. And guess what? You go far enough up the food chain, you start seeing houses and nice cars and semi trucks. And you know what those things do? When they're forfeited to the government in a raid, they create revenue. And this is not new. It's not new to federal law enforcement. The first prosecution I ever did was a methamphetamine trial where the methamphetamine dealer was up the chain a bit, and he had $117,000 in a safe in his house. No job, dealt meth, $117,000. Guess where that money went? It got forfeited and it went to the government. And the government used it for fighting, presumably fighting crime. Justice for these victims would be to not hit the homeless guy with an F1 felony and squash him, but use and I'm not saying they shouldn't be sanctioned for being involved in the drug, but I'm just saying your first offense there is an F1. Your second offense in the chain is an F6. Something doesn't make sense there. And then you discourage the police to go and get into the pockets. Think of it like this. If a bar overserves somebody and they either kill somebody or get killed going home, we have the Dram Shops Act law that the family can sue the bar. Why? Because businesses hate to lose money, and that's how you get them to not overserve people. You want to put the pinch on cartels and do justice for these victims, start hitting seizures. Well, you know what's going to happen when you incentivize hitting the money is the street level offender is not going to be the end of your investigation. The guy that has to take the $20 off of the person seeking a little bit of dope to get his $10 out of that so he can use, he doesn't have a $200,000 car or house or a semi truck. But if you dig in his phone, then you find who he's getting it from. You dig in that person's phone, you find who they're getting, and not too far out of here, you're going to hit a source city. And when you hit a source city, you're going to find assets. When you find assets, you can seize them. When you can seize them, you can sell them. When you can sell them, you can create funds and foundations, and you can fund better law enforcement. If law enforcement's going to say, we don't have the manpower or the money, guess where you can get it? You don't get it from the homeless guy that's sharing with somebody in a tent who falls out. You get it from going up the chain. Some of this is common sense to me that we are losing the war on drugs because we haven't decided to change the approach. We're fighting fentanyl like we fight marijuana, when there's a whole lot of an easier way to hit pinch points harder than we do.
My question is zooming out completely to a more international setting. So our understanding, correct us if we're wrong, is that this is coming from the precursors are coming from China, go to the Mexican cartels who then traffic it across the border, and it kind of spreads out from there. My question for you is, I imagine that would be very hard for local law enforcement to combat across the United States because it's this massive international apparatus that you're up against. So why have we not seen more aggressive actions, in your opinion, at a national level to deal with this crisis, given that it, as you've noted, it seems like it would be possible to maybe be more aggressive, either, stopping this before it even comes into the United States?
I would say that with what I know that we have used military assets to try and curb some of the international influence of fentanyl into Central America and North America, Mexico, but Central America also, because I don't think China and the cartels are just operating out of Mexico. I mean, I think they've got ports and they're doing their input down there in lots of different ways. But I think what we have is a disorganization and a ill-designed structure of attacking this from where we're attacking it predominantly from the bottom up, which does make it difficult. It's much harder to go from a dead body to the kingpin or the head of the cartel than it would be to collect the intel and hit a bigger truck, hit a bigger mule, and then keep it from coming in. I've been concerned that when I listen to drug task force agents say that they're sitting in Indiana buying kilos of fentanyl from cartels in Mexico and having them shipped here. I mean, that seems extremely dangerous because, why would we want to do that? Why can't we at some point, why aren't we hitting it higher up if we can be doing that? So I think that, I tend to be a classic conservative that I think minimal government intrusion into people's lives is important. But I'm also, in being a classic conservative, believe that our government's purpose is health, safety, and welfare. And part of safety and health is, well, if there's something we need to be fighting domestically, I think it's why can't we do some concerted efforts utilizing tools that we have for fighting terrorism to fight this form of terrorism? You could take me out onto an extreme with sort of conspiracy theory that I think we are being poisoned disproportionate to other countries. In researching before coming on this podcast, I wanted to know whether or not there was any data that I could show that would prove that other than just my anecdotal thoughts. And there is. You look at an international drug overdose data pool set. Canada is the next highest after us for fentanyl toxicity overdose deaths per capita, largely attributed to American fentanyl going to Canada. And they are the second to us. They only have a third of the deaths that we have per capita. The next one under that is a continent, and the continent has less than 10% of the deaths that we have. So you could go on a conspiracy theory and say, hey, we are being poisoned, intentionally poisoned. And I don't know whether that's true, but what I can tell you is we have eyes, ears, and capability of lawfully observing and anticipating movements of this sort of tactic and intercepting it and destroying it before it gets to Tent City, Bloomington, Tent City, Indianapolis, a budget in Sharefest between nearly homeless people who are addict. And I do want to say quickly that I disagree with the chief deputy prosecutor's position that people who are sharing or taking a portion of their dope and selling it to a friend are not addicts. I think that misses a huge population that even the DEA guys will tell you that it's happening. A lot of these end users are supporting their habit. They're sharing or selling a very small amount. And so addiction services is something that we're not funding in a very robust way. We're not funding that. We're not seeking to intervene in opioid addictions as strongly as we need to be, obviously, because we're having people die like crazy. You will not hear me say caveat emptor, that these victims they're seeking it out. So that's just part of it. Sadly, I hear law enforcement officers who are worn out, who are tired of administering Narcan, who are tired of fighting harder to save somebody's life than that person necessarily was behaving to want to save their own. I hear them often get calloused to it, which hurts investigations. But if we incentivize moving upstream, then we can choke it off better. If we incentivize attacking upstream, we can do a better job. If we're going to fight this by shooting the foot soldiers or with massive missiles, then we're going to have, splashy headlines that make politicians who have to be tough on crime feel good. And we will have solace to victims' families that the person that dealt them their child's lethal dose is not going to be able to do it for some period of time. But I want to make sure that the listeners understand the gravity of this F1, this level 1 felony in Indiana. It's 20 to 40 years. That's not enough if you think it's murder, right? That's not enough if you think it's attempted murder. But if you look at what the impact of other crimes on people are, you take, for example, child molestation. Child has a lifetime of trauma that they then have to deal with. Starts out as a level 3 felony. And the garden variety example of it's level 3 felony. The top number of a level 3 doesn't hit the bottom number of the level 1. Burglary. When I was a prosecutor, that was one of the crimes that I went after the hardest, was breaking and entering into people's residence, because when a person doesn't feel safe at home, where do they feel safe at? And, that's a level 4 felony. And we're talking a 12-year maximum. The person has to be a hardened criminal to get that. So I understand how we get to assigning a level 1 felony to a death case, but every other level 1 felony has a specific intent to do lasting, grave harm to a person. And every other dealing case where you have a small quantity, it has a far less draconian result. And so we will stock our prisons full of what are really low-level offenders that had a bad outcome of their action. That we will warehouse, that we will impede from recovery, and then will cost us money and won't serve the ends of the war on fentanyl, because you take that guy out and the person knocks next door, or that goes to the tent right next to the tent that this guy used to have. I mean, it seems a drastic waste.
One thing I wanted to ask you is to zoom back in on your own work on this, without going into any details or specifics. As a defense attorney, how do you defend in these overdose death cases, or death by dealing, or dealing causing death? I guess, how do you approach those? What has some of your experience with that been like?
Yeah. So I just had a dealing resulting in death trial a couple weeks ago, not guilty verdict. My approach to these is the science. There's 2 different routes the science goes. First, you have the toxicology, and then you have the cell phone data. And again, because we've made this a level 1 felony offense, I've been underwhelmed by the investigation that occurs. There's a body, there's an autopsy, there's a toxicology result that's done, there's a phone dump, and then there's tracking back to who the police may believe is the dealer. But again, as I told you earlier, they have to prove that the stuff that the dealer sold was the stuff, the actual and proximate cause of the person's death. And, their intervening causes is something I'm looking into. Did law enforcement take out all the intervening causes? In my trial, my client confessed to dealing heroin to the decedent. There's a video of the decedent going into the apartment complex that my client lived at the time, after some Facebook messages, to get heroin. She was a heroin addict. She had been in recovery for 2 years. My guy was her plug prior to her recovery. Her life circumstances led her down the path of relapse. She reaches out to my guy and she sets up a heroin buy, but she's concerned. She doesn't want strong heroin. He may watch this, and I hope he doesn't take offense at this, but if she's concerned about what she's getting from him, it makes sense. He doesn't seem like a chemist. He's probably not the most reliable indicator of strength of what she's going to get. But they set up a dollar amount and a weight amount, and basically a time frame. So she dies. She dies, and she dies of acute fentanyl overdose. And she doesn't have heroin in her system, and she doesn't have xylazine in her system. Months pass because the police didn't view her as a victim. They viewed her as an overdose. They didn't investigate. Her family investigated. They got on her phone and they found the Facebook message between her and my client. They turned that into the state police, and the state police months later tracked the Facebook back to my client and arrest him after presenting that to a judge and making it look like probable cause. My guy was compliant, gave a full confession to dealing heroin. The police knew when they took his interview that she didn't die of heroin. The police also knew that she had in her bra, she had another substance in a paper pack. They didn't ask that paper pack be tested. They didn't tell my guy that she died of fentanyl and didn't have any heroin in her system, which they knew. We get to that information through trial prep. I deposed the detective. Again, a friend of mine who I appreciate his work. But I asked him, what was the stuff in her bra? We don't know. It didn't get tested. Well, that question caused it to get sent off to get tested. It got weighed and it got tested, and it was heroin, xylazine, with a small amount of fentanyl in it. I then deposed the scientists, the Department of Toxicology, and I said, where would heroin show up here? Well, she didn't have any heroin in her system. Where would xylazine show up here? She didn't have any xylazine in her system. I deposed and then in trial examined the state lab person who had the substance that was found in her bra and attested that. And it was a blended substance. It was not a blueberry muffin where a blueberry could have fallen out and she just got unlucky and got the pure fentanyl. It wasn't the cake. A blueberry muffin can fall apart and you get the separate parts. This was a blended substance. The weight, my guy confessed before being told any facts, confessed to cutting into her half a T. What was in her bra was approximately half of a half a T. So the jury believed, and the science bore out, that she was probably scared of my guy's stuff. It had been bad for her in the past, but he was her first source. So she went and got that from him. She then took something else, and how she got to that something else, we don't know, because there was an improper and weak initial investigation. I have ideas that I'm not going to put out here because that would be accusing somebody who's not under investigation nor going to get charged. But she took fentanyl, and she took a massive dose of fentanyl. She had 71 nanograms in her blood, 71 nanograms per milliliter. 3 to 20 can be lethal. The pathologist said that typically deaths around here are in the teens, nanograms in the teens, sometimes 25, 71 was well enough. 3 times the limit, or 3 times what you would expect. When I look at these cases, My job is, there's a citizen that's been accused of something by the government, and the government bears the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt each essential element. And my guy admitted to dealing a drug to her. So I had to, in jury selection, I had to make sure that the jurors knew that that's not enough to convict. It had to be the stuff he sold her that killed her. And so there was an education process with the jury. There was an education process even with the court to a certain extent on making sure the court understood and instructed the jury appropriately on proximate causation and actual causation, intervening cause being a problem. The cell phones they're a wealth of data. But when a law enforcement officer has confirmation bias and wants to close their case at a level 1 felony, maybe they don't pull the cell phone towers. She went after she left buying the heroin that was in her bra that my client sold her to find out where she got the stuff that killed her. Maybe they don't get the cell phone GPS data out of her phone. I don't know why. They have it. I don't know any defense lawyers personally that say we should just let this stuff run rampant. We have clients that are dying of this. I sat next to a lady in January who I can't sit next to anymore because she's overdosed to death. We don't want that. Our job is to make sure that people who are accused by the government are actually guilty if they're convicted. And if they're going to be convicted, that the state meets its burden of proof in the process. So two paths of science I attack and look into, do they have the chemistry? And then do they have the linkage? And the linkage typically comes from looking at alternate sources from phones. And there was an alternate source in this phone that was not investigated. Not sure why, but they got an F1 charge. They just didn't get an F1 conviction, and nor should they, because my client was not guilty of that.
You have answered so many of our questions already. I guess I have one more big one, and then if you have any others. This gets into, what you've said about the war on drugs and some of the failures is very resonant, and sort of looking at it big picture wise versus, and sort of the nuances and why we can understand why some people would want to go after people more directly, but why maybe it also makes sense for us as a country to start thinking, where is this coming from? How do we stop it before it's causing deaths? One thing I would be curious about is, because you've defended folks in this situation and have kind of been immersed in this, what would your message be to people who either are dealing it or are using it or are, parents of kids who might start experimenting with stuff that turns out to be fentanyl, even though they didn't realize it? What kind of things would you say in terms of people being careful out there with this stuff, not just from getting in legal trouble, but from also possibly dying?
One of the things I appreciated about the Chief Deputy Prosecutor's podcast was the anecdotal stories, the victims, the decedents, and how real they were to him. That's powerful to children. And I think we have to start early and start often with youth, because once there's an addiction, common sense is very difficult to infiltrate, right? I'm talking to my clients who are heroin addicts, meth addicts, fentanyl addicts all the time. This is going to kill you. I see this. I've got a list of people that are dead who are my clients because they didn't get out of this. It's such a powerful drug, fentanyl and heroin, either one of them. The addiction is so powerful that's too late. And I think with kids, so I too, like the Chief Deputy, grew up in the DARE era where I felt like I got lied to, because I had Officer Friendly come to the middle school and burn the little incense thing that was supposed to smell like weed and, talk to us about that sort of, and it was, but I was living in this awesome bubble era of naivete in small little town Indiana, where there wasn't a lot of cocaine, and there wasn't, heroin. It was farm people. So we had weed and booze, and those can have their problems too. But this is not that. This is talking to kids early and often about significant, irreversible, or extremely difficult to reverse impacts that one experimentation can lead to. This is talking about not trusting medicine, what looks like medicine, unless it's given to you by a doctor or a parent or an adult. This is parents saying to physicians, I really don't want my child to get OxyContin for this injury or hydrocodone for their throat ache. My wife doesn't even take Novocaine when she gets a cavity filled. Pain management in human beings is a really new thing, new in the scope of mankind. We're talking less than 150 years that any of the canes, Novocaine, cocaine, any of that kind of came into being to help reduce pain. But boy, we don't want to feel an ounce of hurt. And I think parents have to say, there's a risk to my child getting hydrocodone for a throat ache. There's a risk to, on a femur break, getting OxyContin. You can go different routes. And then with kids, it's almost every town paper you can find an overdose, and you can show your kids, this is real. This is real here. It's lethal. It's fatal. That's where it has to start. It has to start with prevention, and then intervention, of course, has to be funded. It has to be scientifically based. These little 28-day clinics that are funded by Medicaid, Medicare, they try, and sometimes they get through. This 988 initiative, which started off being like a suicide prevention initiative, where people in crisis we're going to try not to criminalize them, but we're going to try to move them into a mental health intervention approach. I see that as being fantastically optimistic, and I'm hopeful for it if it has a drug rehabilitation intervention where they're followed up with a system of providers who, where necessary, can medically treat people through detox and the first couple of years of sobriety, and then can also wean them off of the medications that are needed to wean somebody. So, Suboxone is a very common anti-opioid addiction substance, but it too can be addictive and abused. See, the goal would be to get people off the reliance of those sorts of things. But I'm just a public defender. I mean, I really don't have the solution to this problem. I just know that what we're doing isn't working. You're not going to see a decrease in deaths because here's why. There are two types of deterrence. There's specific deterrence and general deterrence. Every time you incarcerate somebody, you specifically deter that person for a limited amount of time, somewhat. I mean, they can still get the dope in jail and hurt people there, but for the most part, you've specifically deterred their conduct. That matters if they have conduct that's limited to them. Incarcerating a murderer is a fantastic, both specific deterrent and general deterrent, because that murderer is not going to go out and commit more murders, and there's not a line of murderers behind them to take their seat. There are lines and lines and lines of dealers that are waiting to become the new plug and aren't seeming to be afraid of, they're not generally deterred by the sanction that they're seeing happen to the guy in the tent next over or the hotel room next over. So it's not having a general deterrent effect. These draconianly hard, disproportionate sanctions for a dealing behavior. We have continued to ratchet up the sanction for dealing drugs since the 70s. And I met with a community resource person this morning, really altruistic lady, wonderful woman, works for a church group and an organization that's trying to reach out to prisoners. And this is what they're saying. We have an increasing prison population that's aged They've been incarcerated for a very, very long time because of drug dealing. They now have no real Social Security because they didn't work. The government's going to have to put them in nursing homes because they can't live on their own. And we don't really have many places to go. So it feels really good to lock people up for a very long time until you figure out, well, we then have to do something with them when they're elderly. And that's going to cost us money. So we keep ratcheting things up, but not solving the problem. I mean, the dope problem, God love Nancy Reagan, but the dope problem, she didn't solve it. And we didn't change much. We continue to use an old school street level approach. And it's an epic failure. Do we scrap it? No. We take what we have at the street level and we use it just like we would use the platoon of Marines in Iraq who's looking for the bomb maker. What did those guys do? They went and they got intelligence off of each person they could get intelligence off of, and then they reported that intelligence back to an organized, centralized hub who then had a task force of people that would go the next chain up until they found the bomb maker. And then they would take the bomb maker and they would try to find, where's this guy getting his stuff? And they would go up the stream from that. Human beings, Americans, have an understanding of how to combat known directional sources of conflict, which is what you can boil down fentanyl to. I mean, it's coming not from here. It's infiltrating our borders. It's being farmed out through source cities. It's then being farmed out from the next level down. We know how this happens. We have the capabilities and the knowledge of how to fight it. We're just not doing a good job of it. And there's going to be a lot of death, and there's going to be a lot of dealing resulting in death trials that make people feel good-ish.
Is there anything we didn't ask you about that you think it's important for the listeners to understand about this topic, or just general, or just thoughts on any of this that you had that you wanted to share?
I think I just want to close up with one of the things that I started with, which is I take a defense approach to this, and I wanted to be the counterpoint to some of the things that I've heard. But that doesn't mean it's lost on me that folks are dying from this nasty, toxic chemical. It doesn't mean that there shouldn't be some redress for decedents and their families, and, have empathy, sympathy, and just compassion for people who have lost loved ones. This does not discriminate. This is happening in a lot of communities, and whether people are positioned economically well or are poor. We're seeing overdoses that are resulting in death. We're seeing fentanyl addiction. We're seeing opioid addiction. And I want it to stop. There'd be nothing better than to go back to the glory days of watching body cam videos of cops taking an ounce of marijuana, throwing it on the ground and stomping on it with their foot. It's like, if that's the worst thing that my client has to deal with, my job is to be on the other end of this and say to the accused, we have to analyze your case very, very carefully. To the pre-accused, get help. To the pre-users, don't start. And to medical professionals and pharmacy companies that want to make humongous profits off of creating opioid addicts legally, shame on you, and give us some money to do the right things with the addicts that you've created and helped spawn. That's not going to be a popular thing to say in Indiana, but there's a lot of money in those companies. I wish our politicians were like NASCAR athletes that have to wear all the lobbyists that pay them their little, patches on there so we can see. But when you are an insurance company or a pharmaceutical company and you pay to play, and how we get here is because of pharmaceutical companies. That's how we got here. The opioid epidemic is an American business. That the fentanyl problem is just a consequence that's coming from it because we're vulnerable to opioid addiction.
Really well said. Thank you so much, Tim, for coming on and sharing your insight with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I hope it benefits, the listeners, and maybe gives some ideas for questions for other people that you're going to talk to. And maybe I'm on a sort of panacea dream of how do we get here? But I foresee very, very bad days ahead before we get to good days. Because I don't see local law enforcement in a rural level intermingling with federal, state law enforcement to move upstream.
We'd like to thank Tim for taking the time to speak with us.
We really appreciate his insight. We hope that if you happen to have any young people in your life, you take a bit of time to talk to them about fentanyl. It's normal for young people to experiment with illicit substances, but fentanyl is a unique danger. It can make a single mistake a lethal one.
Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.